Hello, I'm Frank Congelos. Welcome to the Institute of Responsible Wealth. Our guest today is Mark Kluger. Mark is a partner and founding partner of the law firm Kluger Healey, which specializes predominantly in employment law. Between him and his partner, they have over 25 years of experience in helping business owners and professionals on how to protect their business and their practices. So Mark, it's great to have you with us today, so welcome.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's nice to have you here. Why don't we start by just tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice and what you do? Because I know it's a little different than most law firms.
Well, our firm, Kluger Healey, specializes exclusively in representing employers in the area of labor and employment law. We do a lot of counseling to employers and represent them in litigation if and when they get sued by their employees.
And what as an employer, what can employers do in order to protect themselves and so forth in the event of a lawsuit or whatever the case might be? What should they be doing, or where are they vulnerable even?
Unfortunately today, Frank, most employers, or almost every employer, is vulnerable as long as they have employees to being sued, whether it's a meritorious lawsuit or not, by their employees under the myriad of employment laws that protect employees today. So there's an awful lot of litigation in the area and a lot that employers need to do to protect themselves. One of the things that we find as one of the most common causes of litigation in the area of employment law is employers not effectively communicating their expectations to their employees that result in terminations in the end. And we found that employers who clearly articulate to their employees through job descriptions and then ultimately through hands-on counseling as they're going through the employment process are in a lot better shape when it comes ultimately to avoiding litigation. And part of that really stems from being in a position to explain to an employee when they're not performing effectively what it is exactly that they're not doing, so that an employee understands what the disappointment or unhappiness is with an employee and gives them the opportunity to correct it. In the end, if an employer is able to do that effectively, often employees understand why they get terminated. What we find is that employers avoid doing that more often than not and hang on to their employees far too long. We'd much rather see an employer who makes a decision early on that a relationship's not going to work out, rather than drag it out where it becomes more contentious, more difficult, and everybody ends up unhappy. Then there's a termination, and then there's enough bitterness that you end up in litigation.
So as an employer, okay, so each year they sit down with an employee, and it's sometimes, and we were talking a little bit before about the holiday time, and you said, okay, well, satisfactory. And so what tends to happen is that if you've been doing that for a long period of time and you're really not being truthful, it sounds like it leads to some issues, and you and I discussed that a little bit. Why don't you expand a little bit upon what should employers be doing to better protect themselves as far as with their employee meetings and so forth?
One of the things that we found in lawsuits, in litigation, and sort of reverse engineering what the cause of the problems was that more often than not, employers tend to not effectively communicate their concerns and their problems with employees, and really just use, for lack of a better word, avoidance behavior. And so they will, for example, as you said, during performance review time. Most employers do performance review time around the holidays, the end of the year. What a terrible time to review employees. Merry Christmas, you're a lousy employee. It's just
and here's your pink slip if we weren't real happy.
Exactly. It's just not a great time to do it. And when they do it, they tend to, try and put on a happy face. It's that time of year. Nobody wants to be, the Grinch. So that's the first mistake that employers make, is the timing. Another mistake employers make is they tie performance review to compensation. That is a terrible thing, because one of the things that happens in the performance review process is, if you think about it, I know from my own experience, if you're doing performance review at the same time you're going to be talking about salary with an employee, this is what the employee hears: blah 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 3%. That they don't hear.
That's a good point.
They don't hear the criticism. They don't hear the constructive criticism, presumably, and they just focus on the money. And so what I try and advise employers to do is do your performance review and your compensation review at 2 different times of the year. 6 months apart is great, and focus on performance when you're focusing on performance. And then do it honestly. As you said, one of the things we see in litigation is bad documentation, and that bad documentation is are the performance reviews, that annual performance appraisal. More often than not, what we see is, a long history of performance reviews, and you know what those forms look like, Frank. Everybody's, seen them. Any, employee or employer has seen them. It's, one of these, circle the right adjective, and it's, excellent, good, satisfactory, fair, and poor. And human nature being what it is, somebody, a manager may be looking at that and saying, well, I'm not going to say they're excellent because they're not. I'm not going to say they're good because they're not. And they stop at satisfactory. Number one, it's the one in the middle. So the I goes there, right? It's, out of 5, it's the one in the middle. So people go there. Plus, to most managers, it's a way of avoiding conflict. If they say that they're poor or fair, they feel like they're going to have an angry employee that they need to really justify that evaluation to. So they say satisfactory. Then they call us before the termination, or we get the case in litigation, and they say, this is the worst employee we've ever had. How long have they worked for you? 10 years. Great. All right, let's see the performance review forms that demonstrate, that are the evidence of that 10 years of poor performance. And we look at them, and invariably, you got 10 years of satisfactory. Now you take a performance review that says satisfactory in front of a jury, and all they got to do is run to the dictionary and say, what does the word satisfactory mean? It means meeting expectations. How do you terminate an employee who's meeting expectations? You've set the expectations, and if the employee is meeting them, how are you going to tell me that they're a lousy employee for the last 10 years? And so that's where we end up with cases where a jury is going to say to us, well, if the performance was sufficient because they were meeting expectations, then there had to be an ulterior motive. And that ulterior motive is invariably tied to the reason for the lawsuit: age, gender, race, national origin, whatever the category is that employee falls into and is suing over.
Interesting. Mark, as you're explaining that, you used a term you called performance, and I know that your firm also works in a unique area of performance management, which really ties into this and helping people. What is it on the performance management side that as a law firm, or even that people can get, where they can get help, and what does it mean? What do you do?
Well, Frank, from seeing a lot of these lawsuits, we sort of learned that some of the things I just explained really are inherent in most organizations. No matter how sophisticated the organization, performance management seems to be where things fail and result in litigation. And so we've developed a performance management training program to help employers do this the right way from the outset, that is, manage their employees effectively. The ideal goal of performance management, of course, is to create a good, efficient, effective employee. That's the number one goal. But at the same time, it is also a great way to create a defense in the event that there is going to be that litigation that may come if you have to terminate an employee. So what performance management training does is it starts with the assumption that most people who become managers and supervisors get there because they're good at a particular job. That's how most people rise through the ranks in any organization. They're good at what they do. That does not necessarily mean, however, that they're good at managing people. There are some people for whom that comes naturally, but it's very rare. And so most people don't become managers of people without the tools to do the job effectively. And so what our performance management training program does is it helps them understand what their obligations are to manage employees effectively. And that includes setting goals and clearly articulating those goals. It's hard work to sit down and think about exactly what you want your employees to do and how you want them to do it, and when they're not doing it well, to be able to articulate to them how to do it better. But that really is what a manager's job is. And so what we do is we recognize that human nature being what it is, a lot of us just want to avoid conflict. And so when we do performance management where we're unhappy with an employee, we tend not to be honest. We tend not to really say, this is the problem. And that's because we think it's going to be a negative conversation. I hear from managers all the time that when they're going to do performance management, they have a pit in their stomach before they have that conversation. And I always wonder, why does the manager have a pit in their stomach when they're going to evaluate the employee? And it's because they're concerned about confrontation, about a negative event. And so what our performance management program does is it changes the mindset of the manager so that it's not a negative event. You have to look at performance management as a positive event. It's an opportunity to help an employee reach their own potential. And if it's approached that way, it can be a very effective tool to either helping that employee become a better employee or making a decision that that employee is not right for the job. The mindset is simply this. if you go to that employee, any employee, and you say, would you like to be the best you can be at your particular job? Whatever the job is, it really doesn't matter. Would you like to be the best you can be? Most people are going to say yes. There are some people who are very pleased with mediocrity, and that's okay.
There's some, I just want to get by, and then you know you got the wrong person in the first place.
That's right, and that helps you evaluate that.
Exactly.
But if you present it that way, would you like to be the best you can be, most people will respond positively. Then, who best to help that person reach their potential but their manager, the person who knows how to do the job better than anyone? And so that manager holds the keys to being able to help the employee. And if they offer that opportunity, I can help you be the best you can be, and here's how you get there. Here's the roadmap to getting there. Well, that's a positive experience.
Much different than pointing out everything you're doing wrong.
That's right. And yet at the same time, it's really covering the same territory. It's saying, this is the way you need to do this particular aspect of your job. This is the way you need to do this. And if you do these things, you will be the employee that I want you to be, and the employee you can be. And if it's approached that way, performance management can be a very positive experience and accomplish the dual goal of creating a good, effective employee, and then allowing the manager to go about their job and maybe do better in their position and rise through the ranks that way. It really is a mindset, and it's a methodology of teaching managers how to get the best performance, and ultimately, as I said, create a set of documentation that helps really lay out if an employee is not meeting expectations, so that if we do have to end up in litigation, we can go to a jury, we can go into court, and we can say, the employee was given every opportunity to succeed. We set out the following goals. They're articulated clearly. They're reasonable. They're achievable, and with time frames to achieve them. If that's done effectively for every employee and they fail, ultimately a jury who is made up, in the end, most juries are made up of employees, the jury is going to understand the inherent fairness of the ultimate termination if it happens.
What's interesting, Mark, is that as I listen to this, part of what I'm hearing is that for an employer, it's a matter of documentation and making sure that you're documenting things. But then it's a communication issue, which is making sure that you're clearly communicating everything that needs to be happening. And it's interesting as an employer myself, and as I listen to this, is it something that it's 1 in 100 that you're going to say one small chance that this may happen, or is it a higher percentage that's actually where you actually end up with that? All of a sudden you get this certified, somebody dropping off a letter to you, you need to sign for it, and you're opening up, oh my gosh, what do I have here? And then you open up and say, I'm being sued for what? What are the type of percentages that are out there? How often is this? Is it once in a lifetime for an employer? Is it a never?
Well, it obviously depends on the size of the employer and how many employees they have. But all employers are vulnerable to litigation. You can have one employee and be vulnerable to litigation. Right. And I hate to say it, but the percentage is very high, Frank, of those employers who ultimately, during the course of a career, or during the course of the lifespan of a business, end up in litigation, or at least with that demand letter served on them. Anytime somebody terminates an employee, you're vulnerable, and it doesn't matter how good an employer you are, how fair you are to your employees.
What's interesting is when we chat a little bit, the numbers, because I said, Mark, is it 50%? You go, no, it's higher than 50%. So I was looking at it like, well, if it's more than 50%, when you're dealing with this type of an issue, it's not a matter of if it ever happens, it's a matter of when it happens, because you have to look at it as we live in a different society today. And you have a lot of people that they have a different mindset. It's a mindset sometimes of entitlement, not a mindset of responsibility, which we promote. So when someone thinks in terms of that entitlement mentality, they're like, oh, I got fired, maybe I can get paid before I leave. And it's kind of, I call it the shakedown, or whatever the case might be. So as an employer, you really need to do the diligence and to spend the time to protect themselves.
That's right. It is unfortunate, Frank, that we live in such a litigious society and that we have to be so defensive in how we conduct our business, but we do, and that's the reality. And so it's important to be prepared for that. And of course, most employers look at themselves as being fair in the way they treat their employees, and more often than not, that's true. But to be able to prove it, to be able to demonstrate it, is unfortunately the world we live in, and we need to be able to do that on a really, as you said, using appropriate documentation.
Well, so what would be the words of wisdom that you would impart upon, the business owners that are listening to our program today, and they're seeing, this interview? What is it that they should be doing in order to, get their ducks in a row, make sure that they're protecting themselves and protecting their business? What would be the steps that they should follow?
Well, I think the first thing, Frank, is always to understand in hiring somebody what you're really looking for and what you want them to do when you hire them, so that you really create a very clear roadmap for an employee of what the employer expectations are. And it really is something that has to be thought through in advance and then articulated in advance, beginning from the hiring process. Really from the first interview with a prospective employee, an employer needs to explain in very tangible ways, not broad strokes, not big picture only, but in, daily task-oriented kinds of explanations as to what is expected of an employee. And then to follow through with that once the employee is hired, to make sure that the employee is properly trained and understands all the aspects of their job, and if they don't, give them the opportunity to learn them, to continuously document what is and isn't going right and explain and communicate that stuff to the employee. One of the things I really want employers to understand is I never want an employer to feel like a prisoner to their employees, afraid to terminate somebody, afraid to discipline them for fear of litigation, and yet I hear that from employers all the time. Among the things, in addition to really being aggressive about communication, is, and again, an unfortunate aspect of our society is, I think it's really important for all employers to have employment practices liability insurance. It's a form of commercial insurance. It's sold as a means of protecting employees in the event of litigation, and that does minimize the risk in terms of potential losses if you've got the insurance in place.
Changes the mindset a little bit, which is you're running your business then out of a position of strength and confidence, rather than running your business out of a position of vulnerability and a little bit of fear that it's like, geez, I've been in business a long time. Maybe I didn't do a great job of documentation, but I got this problem employee, and now what do I do with it because I haven't paid attention to it in so many years? The type of insurance that you just described, I'm not as familiar with it. They get it through who? Their property and casualty agent? Is it part of a business policy? What is it?
It's typically sold separately from the business policy, but yes, from property and casualty insurance brokers typically sell it, and there are some very significant carriers that write programs. Some of them are very industry specific. It's priced based on the number of employees, so it's typically affordable for most employers.
It's very interesting. Mark, I thank you so much for your time being with us today. I mean, for a business owner, and a lot of the programs that we put out are really designed to help individuals and both business owners how to get what you want in life and how to protect yourself and to grow and build your wealth. And your information today has been great. So, Mark, I thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's really been a pleasure having you. So, again, thank you for being with us on behalf of the Institute of Responsible Wealth, and we wish you a great day.